There was a time when this land breathed. Rivers carved silver veins through valleys that held the weight of forests, and cities of white marble reached toward the clouds, catching the first light of every dawn. It was a tapestry of life, woven in green and gold, built to endure for an eternity. But time is a patient predator. The rivers did not just dry, they vanished, leaving behind cracked, thirsty scars in the earth. The marble monuments did not merely crumble. Wind pulverized stone to dust. Silence reigns. Gray silt shifts where water roared. Valleys leveled, forests gone, horizon flattened. Erased, hollow monument to ambition and ruin. Bruised orange sky suffocates earth. Sickly glow, long shadows stretch. Wind's mournful dirge tears silence. It carries the acrid scent of iron and ancient, oxidized decay, a sharp sting that bites at the back of the throat. Silt swirls, ghost-like columns dance. Restless winds scour, polishing bone. The horizon is lost to the haze, blurring the line between the scorched ground and the heavy, lightless sky. Ancient ruins' weary air watches silently. Against the jagged cliffs, a figure emerged from the swirling grit. KL moved with the silence of a shadow. Boots ghosted powdery wasteland. Terrain a measured gait. His body angled against the relentless wind. Behind him, a long, frayed fabric trailed through the dust. Stones snagged. Leaving a faint scar, he strode on. Ghostly steps in decay's embrace. A calculated placement of weight to avoid the loose shale that could betray his position. He reached a precarious ridge, the ground beneath him groaning under the pressure of the wind. Yet he remained anchored, a stark, upright contrast to the flattened horizon. Bruised sky framed him, lone figure against chaos. Kale stopped. His eyes, sharp and perpetually vigilant, darted across the jagged landscape. He did not blink. He scanned the horizon with the precision of a predator, breaking the vast, empty panorama into manageable sectors. Light shifts, dust ripples, all noted. Chaos patterns sought, for the subtle irregularities that signaled life in a place defined by death. His gaze locked onto a distant ridge. He scanned the shadowed canyon floor for glinting metal. Silt stirred. A gust obscured his view. He stared, eyes narrowed, waiting for the haze to clear. Wasteland's deadly trap. Hesitation meant death. He stood ready. Kael's boots crunched shale, eyes fixed ahead. Hot stone pulsed. A sun-baked ridge. He reached past the cliff's edge. As he settled into this new position, a subtle tremor traveled up through the soles of his boots. It was not the wind. Deep thuds vibrated earth, faint yet persistent. He froze, fingers gripping rock, straining to hear over the gale. Mechanical pulse vibrated, canyon floor below. There, where the shadows pooled thickest, a new shape emerged from the haze. His posture hardened. His stillness broke, alert and coiled. He found it. A slave train. A jagged scar of misery groans below. Gaunt beasts, ribs like girders, strained in harnesses. Heads hung low, eyes dull, cages scraped. KL gasped at suffering scale. Black banner, red sigil, hot wind. Morvane's sight struck him. Jaw clenched. Cold detachment shattered. White knuckles gripped. Focus narrowed. To the center of the grim procession, he had found them. The goblins moved with a frantic, twitching energy, their limbs long and spindly against the backdrop of the canyon. They swarmed the convoy, darting between the straining beasts and the iron cages like insects drawn to rot. A whip cracked, air whistling, striking the metal bars of a cage with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Guttural cackles tore the silence. Another goblin kicked at the base of a cage, its clawed feet scraping against the iron, followed by a series of wet, thudding impacts. Whip cracked, air hissed. Kale heard only its sting. He took a final, steadying breath, his eyes locking onto the lead tormentor, and shifted his weight to descend. Wind ripped the banner against bruised sky. Wings arched, stark crown revealed. A dark chalice, Morvane's siegel, struck him. Jaw clenched. Years hunting house whispers. Ruin's trail bled red sigil. Shoulders coiled, purpose hardened, noise faded. Enemy banner, crushing truth. He held his breath, He simply locked the image into his mind, letting the cold, sharp clarity of his mission replace every other thought. The sigil hung in the air, a stain against the horizon, and KL finally let the mask of the Wanderer slip. Jaw clenched, boots crunched on grit, and the words escaped him like a low, dangerous growl. "Found you." The phrase carried the weight of years. Hunter's gaze, piercing the gale. Fingers found the worn grip. Steel slid from leather. A soft rasp vibrated the cliff. He tested the weapon's weight. Convoy crawled. Kale dug in shale. He leaped from the ledge into the void. The descent was a blur of shale and gravity. Kale hit the canyon floor with a muffled thud. Knees absorbed shock. Body folded low. Stale air, iron, dust. He awaited alarms, shouts, clatter, but the canyon remained unnervingly still. He rose slowly, his boots sinking into the soft, shifting ground. Convoy 50 yards off, silence fell, hand near hilt, eyes scanned shadows. His instincts screamed wrong. Silence pressed like a weight. Beasts froze, breath hitched, stillness froze KL, air thick with rising tension. He strained, seeking iron cages scrape, but silence reigned. Wind's hollow sigh echoed. Blade gripped tight. Beasts froze, eyes wide. He scanned rocks for ambushes. Steel flashed, world shattered, scream ripped air. It was not the cry of a prisoner, but the guttural, panicked shriek of a goblin. It echoed off the canyon walls, distorted and frantic. Kale flinched, his eyes snapping toward the source of the sound. The stillness was gone, replaced by a sudden, violent eruption of chaos. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, his pulse hammering against his ribs as the realization hit him. The convoy was not just silent, it was being dismantled. The scream hung in the air, a dying note that spurred Kale into motion. He did not hesitate. He lunged toward the canyon edge, boots finding purchase on the loose, shifting shale. He was a blur of kinetic energy, his body leaning into the steep, jagged descent. Rocks crumbled beneath his weight, tumbling into the abyss, but he ignored the instability. He vaulted over a protruding ridge, his hands grazing the cold, abrasive stone as he pivoted around a sharp bend. His focus narrowed to the floor of the canyon, where the faint, rhythmic clatter of iron had been replaced by the wet, sickening sound of steel meeting flesh. He dropped down a 10-foot ledge, landing with a heavy, controlled impact that sent dust billowing around his legs. He did not stop to breathe. He pushed his legs harder, his stride lengthening, his hand never leaving the hilt of his blade. The hunt had begun. Kale skidded to a halt, the momentum of his sprint dying instantly as the scene unfolded before him. The air here was heavy, saturated with the copper tang of fresh blood and the dry, suffocating dust of the wasteland. 5 goblins lay scattered across the canyon floor, but they were not the victims of a frantic brawl. They were the subjects of a grim, calculated execution. Each body was positioned with unsettling care, limbs aligned, heads tilted at identical angles toward the canyon wall. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds, only the clean, singular lines of deep, precise cuts that had ended their lives in a heartbeat. Kale stepped over a discarded whip, his boots crunching on broken shale. He scanned the perimeter, searching for the signature of a chaotic skirmish, but finding only the cold, rhythmic efficiency of a master. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. He crouched beside the lead goblin, his fingers hovering inches above the cooling, dark stain on the sand. Kale stood slowly, his gaze sweeping the shadows. Kale pivoted, his boots sliding silently across the grit. He stopped, 20 paces away. The carnage took on a new, sharper focus. Standing in the center of the slaughter was a figure, motionless as the canyon walls themselves. The sunlight caught the silver of his hair, a stark, metallic shimmer against the bruised orange sky. He did not look at Kale. He did not look at the bodies at his feet. He simply stood, his posture balanced and terrifyingly relaxed. A long, slender blade hung from his hand, held at a downward angle. A single drop of crimson blood detached from the tip, falling to the dust with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire canyon. KL felt the air tighten. The goblins were merely the debris of a storm that had already passed. This figure was the storm. Kale kept his hand near his own weapon, his fingers twitching against the leather grip. He watched the blade. Kale did not close the distance. He held his ground. His weight shifted slightly to the balls of his feet, ready to pivot or strike. He studied the stranger with a clinical, detached focus. The warrior stood with a terrifying economy of motion, his center of gravity perfectly aligned, his shoulders loose and devoid of tension. Kale watched the rise and fall of the stranger's chest. It was a slow, rhythmic cycle, undisturbed by the recent violence or the presence of an armed intruder. There was no ragged gasping, no spike in heart rate, no tremor in the hand that held the blade. This was the stillness of a predator that had conserved every ounce of energy for the kill. Kael's gaze traced the lines of the stranger's posture, noting the way his feet were planted, to allow for an instantaneous shift in any direction. This was not the erratic, desperate stance of a wasteland survivor. It was the deliberate, practiced poise of a professional. Every detail, the way the blade hung, the lack of wasted movement, the absolute silence screamed of a lethal history. Kale felt his own muscles coil in response. The silence in the canyon was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against the eardrums. Kale held his position, his fingers hovering inches from his blade, his eyes locked on the stranger. He expected a sudden movement, a feint, or a direct charge. Instead, the stranger simply tilted his head, his gaze shifting to meet Kale's with a terrifying, detached calm. The warrior's voice arrived, low and steady, carrying across the dust without a tremor of exertion. "You have been following me." The words were not a question. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the same clinical precision he had used to dispatch the goblins. Kale felt his pulse quicken, a sharp spike of adrenaline that he forced down into his core. The accusation hung in the stagnant air, vibrating with unspoken threat. The stranger did not blink. He did not tighten his grip on the blade. He simply waited, his posture remaining perfectly balanced, his breathing unchanged by the confrontation. The air between them felt thin, charged with the static of an impending clash. Kale shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the loose shale, and prepared his response. Kale did not deny it. He let the silence stretch, watching the warrior's eyes for any sign of a shift. He allowed a slow, sardonic smirk to pull at the corner of his mouth, a deliberate provocation meant to break the man's icy detachment. Kale took a single, measured step forward, his boots crunching against the dry, brittle earth. "You move with precision," Kale said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the stagnant canyon air. Clean cuts, efficient, professional. He paused, his gaze flicking briefly toward the pile of bodies before locking back onto the warrior's face. "But you were sloppy." The warrior's expression remained unreadable, but his shoulders tightened by a fraction of an inch. Kale gestured vaguely toward the shadows behind the warrior, where the jagged rock face met the canyon floor. "You killed 5 goblins," Kale continued, "and you missed the 6th. The warrior's head jerked, his eyes widening as he realized the gap in his own lethal efficiency. Kale watched the change, his own hand tightening on his weapon. The warrior pivoted, his blade carving a wide, defensive arc through the stagnant air. His eyes darted toward the shadows, searching for the movement Kale had identified. He was fast, but he was looking in the wrong direction. Kale did not wait for the warrior to find the target. His hand moved in a blur, a motion so fluid it seemed to bypass the air itself. A silver streak tore across the canyon, whistling as it cut through the silence. It was not a strike at the warrior, but a correction of his failure. The dagger struck true. A wet, choked sound erupted from the darkness behind the warrior, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the dust. The warrior froze, his blade still raised, his head snapping toward the spot where the goblin had been hiding. The silence that followed was different now, stripped of the tension of an unknown threat. Kale watched the warrior's reaction, his own hand resting casually on his hip. Kale stood still, letting the weight of the moment settle between them, his gaze steady and unyielding as the dust began to settle around the fresh kill. Kale did not wait for the warrior to process the kill. He stepped forward, his boots crunching rhythmically against the dry, sun-baked earth. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, closing the gap until he stood just within the warrior's reach. The air between them felt thick, charged with the lingering scent of iron and ozone. Kale stopped, his posture loose, his eyes locked onto the warrior's face. He tilted his head slightly toward the shadow where the goblin had been hiding. "Behind you," Kale rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. As the words left his lips, the goblin's body finally gave way. It slumped forward, sliding from the rock face with a wet, heavy thud. The warrior did not flinch, but his grip on his blade slackened just enough to show the strain. He looked at the corpse, then back at Kyle. Kale held his ground, arms hanging at his sides, his breathing steady and slow. He did not offer a smile or a challenge. He simply watched. The warrior's gaze sharpened, scanning Kale from head to toe. For a long moment, neither man moved. They stood as two predators, measuring the other. The warrior turned, his movement smooth, devoid of any wasted energy. He brought his blade down to his side, the tip hovering inches above the parched earth. He did not rush the motion, nor did he hesitate. As he completed the pivot, his eyes locked onto Kale. The air in the canyon seemed to freeze, the low hum of the wind dying away entirely. Kale held his position, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his hands hanging loose. He did not blink. He did not shift. He allowed the warrior to look, to measure, to calculate the threat. The warrior's pupils narrowed, his gaze tracing the line of Kale's jaw, the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his stance. It was a silent, brutal assessment. Each man was a predator in his own right, and in that narrow space, they were testing the limits of the other's reach. The heat radiating from the canyon walls felt secondary to the pressure building between them. Every breath was measured, every muscle coiled, waiting for a twitch or a sign of weakness. There was no room for error here. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as they stood amidst the carnage of the convoy. It was a standoff of pure intent, where the only thing that mattered was the next heartbeat. KL remained a statue, his eyes reflecting the same cold, analytical focus. The warrior broke the silence first. He did not lower his blade, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, the rigid line of his posture softening into something more fluid. His eyes remained fixed on Kyle, tracking the subtle rise and fall of his chest. The warrior tilted his head, a gesture of genuine, calculated interest. "You have been following me," he said. His voice was steady, stripped of the earlier aggression, carrying a calm that felt out of place among the scattered bodies. Kale did not answer immediately. He let the words hang in the stagnant air, watching how the warrior's fingers tightened and loosened around the hilt of his weapon. The warrior took a half step forward, his gaze searching Kale's face for a flicker of recognition or a sign of intent. The hostility that had defined their first moments was receding, replaced by a sharp, probing curiosity. It was a dangerous shift. The warrior was no longer looking for a target, he was looking for an origin. Kale remained motionless, letting the warrior's observation linger in the dust. Kale did not rush his reply. He let the silence stretch, watching the warrior wait for an answer that wasn't coming. He shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the loose gravel, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the canyon. He looked past the warrior, his gaze sweeping over the fallen figures, then slowly returned his focus to the man standing before him. The warrior's posture remained rigid, his blade still angled toward the ground, waiting for a confession or a lie. Kale allowed a faint, sardonic smirk to touch his mouth, a gesture that signaled he was no longer playing the part of the observed. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the air between them vibrate with the shift in momentum. The warrior's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his weapon, but Kyle simply shrugged. It was a casual, dismissive movement. "Neither are you," Kale said. His voice was low, steady, and devoid of the caution that had defined the previous minutes. The retort hung in the stagnant heat, refusing to dissipate. For several long seconds, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of cooling metal from the nearby wreckage. The warrior did not react with anger or surprise. Instead, he seemed to absorb the statement, his gaze locking onto Kale with a new, piercing intensity. He shifted his weight, the movement slow and measured, as if testing the ground beneath them for instability. Kale held his position, his hands relaxed but ready, his eyes tracking the warrior's every twitch. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the static of a standoff that had moved beyond simple hostility. It was a vacuum of intent, a space where either man could have struck, yet neither did. The warrior's chest rose and fell in a steady, controlled rhythm, his blade angled downward. Kale watched the way the light hit the dust motes swirling around them, his own breathing matching the quiet cadence of the canyon. They were two predators in a graveyard, caught in a moment of absolute stillness that felt as dangerous as the combat that had preceded it. The standoff held, a fragile architecture of tension built on nothing but breath and intent. Kale did not blink, his focus fixed on the warrior's hands, watching for the slightest tightening of fingers against the hilt. The warrior remained motionless, his silver hair catching the dull orange light of the wasteland sky, his expression unreadable. Slowly, the warrior's shoulders dropped, the rigid line of his spine softening just enough to break the predatory posture. He looked down at the ground and back to Kale, his eyes scanning Kale's face with a clinical, searching intensity that felt like a weight being pressed against his skin. The air in the canyon seemed to thin, the oppressive heat giving way to a sudden, sharp clarity. The warrior's grip on his blade loosened, his fingers unfurling until the weapon hung limp at his side. No longer a threat, but a tool of necessity. He exhaled, a long, steady sound that stirred the fine silt at his feet. There was no apology, no softening of the hard lines of his face, only a sudden, profound shift in the atmosphere. The warrior tilted his head, his gaze locking onto Kale's with a new, singular focus. He moved his chin in a sharp, singular motion, a downward dip that carried the weight of a binding contract. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of an equal. The silence in the canyon was no longer a weapon, but a bridge. The warrior remained still, his eyes never leaving Kale, but the predatory edge had vanished from his gaze. He shifted his weight, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. He cleared his throat, a raspy, dry sound that spoke of days spent in the dust. His lips parted, and for a moment, he simply breathed, as if testing the air for any remaining threat. Then, he spoke. The name was a single, sharp syllable that cut through the stagnant heat, carrying the weight of a history Kale could only guess at. Varian. He did not offer a title or a rank, just the name, delivered with a calm, steady resonance. Kale felt the sound vibrate in the air between them, a stark contrast to the guttural shouts of the goblins that had filled this space only minutes before. It was a declaration of identity, a final dismantling of the wall that had stood between them. Kale let the name settle, watching the way Varian held his ground, his posture now open, his blade resting against his side. The tension that had coiled in Kale's shoulders finally began to ebb, leaving behind a cold, clear alertness. The name hung in the air, a fragile, singular truth in a world built on lies. The name Varian did not simply fade. It seemed to catch on the jagged stone walls, echoing back and forth until the canyon itself held the sound. Where the guttural shrieks of the goblins had clawed at the air only moments ago, a strange, hollow stillness now settled over the floor of the ravine. Kale watched the dust motes dance in the bruised orange light, the silence no longer heavy with the threat of steel, but charged with the weight of a truce. He tasted the name on his own tongue, a silent repetition that felt like a key turning in a long rusted lock. Varian stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the canyon rim, his presence no longer a disruption to the landscape but a part of it. The acrid scent of iron and death began to dissipate, replaced by the dry, sterile smell of the shifting wasteland wind. Kyle took a slow, measured breath, feeling the tension drain from his hands as he finally let his own blade settle into its sheath. They were no longer two predators circling in the dark, but two survivors standing in the wreckage of a world that had tried to break them both. Kale stepped over the final body, his boots crunching against the dry, brittle earth. He did not look back at the carnage. Instead, he scanned the canyon walls, searching for the path that led upward, toward the open expanse. Beside him, the other man moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his presence now a steady weight against the oppressive silence. They stood for a heartbeat in the center of the clearing, two figures framed by the jagged, shadow-cast stone. There was no need for further words. blood on the ground and the stillness of the air had said enough. Kale turned his gaze toward the horizon where the bruised sky met the endless, shifting dust. Varion followed his line of sight. They began to walk, their footsteps falling in a rhythmic, synchronized cadence that echoed against the canyon walls. As they climbed the slope, the walls began to recede, revealing the vast, desolate panorama. They moved as one into the sun-scorched expanse. They reached the summit of the ridge, the ground beneath them shifting from solid rock to loose, treacherous shale. Below, the wasteland stretched out like an ocean of frozen, rusted waves, vanishing into a haze of heat and dust. Kale stopped, his silhouette sharp against the bruised orange sky. Beside him, Varian stood just as still, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind surged, a low, mournful whistle that tugged at their frames. But neither man flinched. The camera began its slow, deliberate retreat, pulling back from the ridge until the two figures were mere specks against the immense, broken landscape. The vastness of the world was absolute, a silent testament to the ruin that had come before. Yet they remained, 2 points of defiance in a sea of decay. There was no grand speech, no dramatic gesture to mark the moment. Only the shared rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing. As the distance grew, the horizon seemed to open, offering a sliver of space where the light hit the dust just right, turning the gray grit into a fleeting, golden path. They turned in unison, stepping forward into the vast, unforgiving expanse. Their journey had only just begun,